I read The Bands of Mourning by Brandon Sanderson for the Summer of Cosmere, where I'm reading every Cosmere story in their published order and then talking about the connections between them. So this will include spoilers, possibly, for Elantris, the original Mistborn trilogy, Warbreaker, The Way of Kings, Words of Radiance, The Alloy of Law, Shadows of Self, and some short stories as well. The Bands of Mourning takes place not too long after the previous book. And so, Wax continues to be a consulting detective for the constabulary in Ellendale. And at the beginning of the book, he tries to get married to Steris, finally. So they met in the first book in Era 2, set up a very dry and clinical arrangement to merge their houses together in a mutually beneficial kind of transactional relationship. And then now they've become more friendly. They're kind of fond of each other, but there's not like anything really emotionally deep there. And when Wax goes to the altar, if you will, where he's, going to do the deed, he feels really bad about it. He has that bad internal feeling that I keep talking about through the Cosmere, where this kind of inner conscience is telling him, like, this is the wrong thing to do right now. And there's a lot of complicated reasons I think that is happening with him that, directly touch back to what happened in the previous book where he murdered Lessie. He finally kind of confronted that deep trauma about his position as the perpetrator or the victim, and having to confront the fact that Lessie was not simply a victim of his, which simply makes him the perpetrator, but that she was both perpetrator and victim at the same time, and that he deeply loved her and at the same time felt that she needed to die for her own good, that there was a mercy in her dying. And so he feels conflicted about it. He feels self-loathing and hatred, but also like a deep confusion because his entire kind of worldview has been scrambled around because of this whole thing. And I think some part of Wax knows that if he gets married, that this is like a big moving on from Lessie, right? That he, in marrying Steris, that closes this chapter of his life that has to do with his being in love with Lessie, that he's going to have to let some part of her go and that he's not ready for that. But at the same time, I think there's a fear that he has about the way that he destroyed this woman that he cared about. So how could he allow himself to care about someone else? That's probably going to destroy Steris as well, right? I think that's the kind of unconscious fear that's living inside Wax in this moment, that his love has some kind of dangerous element tied to it. I talked about that kind of thinking when it came to Kaladin, where he has the brand on his head that says, the Shash brand that says dangerous. And he believes that that's something essentially true about himself when it comes to, any friends that he makes. He ends up getting them killed. He loses all of the people who are important to him. And therefore his friendship, his love, his affection is dangerous in and of itself. That kind of thinking has to do with like a self-hatred, a self-loathing, a mistrust of giving yourself the thing that you need as a person in having friends and companionship and caring about other people, in having connections. Before the wedding, Wax and Steris even talk about this, where she is like, I've got all of my people for the wedding set up. What about the people that I should invite for you? And she's like inviting former enemies of his from the roughs, like gangs and various outlaws and stuff like that. So not even like other law enforcement companions or whatnot, or even like maybe ex-lovers who are in the roughs. It seems like Wax didn't have that kind of thing. He only ever had Lessie, I guess. And so he doesn't really care about his family, right? He has, his uncle out there, but that's like his arch nemesis. So he's not going to invite that guy to the wedding. And so he just doesn't have any relationships or friends. And I think that that is directly linked to the way that he destroyed Lessie in the past, but also now in the present. And Wax is afraid to have close relationships with people because they end so violently and tragically and so personally, where he is the one responsible for that death. So now he thinks that, in marrying Steris, he's going to destroy her, but also this relationship is some other final emotional destruction of his connection to Lessie. And so I think very naturally all of that, makes him feel bad. This is not the right move in his life right now. And I guess luckily, quote unquote, Wayne causes a massive accident, if you could call it that, where a water tower lands on the church and floods the whole thing before the ceremony can be completed. And so Wax is not married to Steris, and her whole day is ruined. And Steris has a similar kind of feeling about everything that happens to her, right? Like Wax is afraid that I'm going to have these close relationships and it's going to end terribly. Steris believes that everything that she tries to do ends in catastrophic, unexpected failure. And so she has this kind of compulsive need to make lists that show all the different ways that things could possibly go wrong, that she has this anxiety about the future, and the way that she solves that anxiety is by listing all of the things that could happen and building contingency plans for them. But, while she had contingency plans for different criminals, interrupting the ceremony and like a stampede of cattle in the church, she never did think about the water tower falling down on the building and flooding everything. That wasn't one of the contingencies. And so she actually does really feel responsible for that happening, because in her mind, somehow, since she didn't think of it, that allowed for the catastrophe to take place. And there's something there about the way that Steris approaches the future that, to me, links up with the Stormlight Archive, where we think about the way that the future is forbidden to people in the Alethi culture, in the Vorin culture, where trying to know the future is linked with the void bringers, right? That there's something evil about it because it puts the destination before the journey. And I think that is kind of how Steris lives her life. And I think this is interesting for two reasons. So one, it does have this effect on Steris where she is feeding her anxiety, actually. Like, she thinks that this is soothing for her, but actually what it means is that she lives in a state where she is she knows, quote unquote, that something bad will happen in the future. And we've seen throughout the Cosmere that when characters believe that there is no way out, that you don't have faith that there's a solution to your problem, that this is kind of like the root of evil in the Cosmere. This is the wrong path to go down. And so I think that Steris focusing on not just the future, but on a bad future, on all of the bad outcomes that somehow are inevitable. She's trying to like sift through all of these bad things that could happen, orients her focus on a future that does not serve her. In other words, she has no plans for success, for flourishing, for happiness. You think about like back in Elantris with Raoden, the way that he's planning for the future. He's like, we're going to take this, instead of eating this seed corn now, we're going to plant it and we're going to harvest lots of corn later, including more seed corn. And we will continue to like build and build and build, right? That's not the way that Steris's lists work. They're just a bunch of bad scenarios that are going to happen. However, I think that this helps to point out something that I talked about at the end of the third Mistborn book, where there are these strong differences between the different worlds. You know, for all the things that the Cosmere worlds and Uber story have in common with each other, there is a real difference between the Scadrial, the Mistborn world, and Roshar, you know, the Stormlight Archive world, and all of these other worlds that we've visited throughout the story so far. They each have their own feeling, and to a certain degree, they have their own morality. And so I don't want to project onto Scadrial the Rosharan, you know, right and wrong ways of being, because I think that the story doesn't characterize Steris's fixation on this anxiety in quite the same way that it would be on Roshar. There is a real catharsis that Steris experiences by listing out all of these bad scenarios. And for her, I think it does clear away some kind of psychic and emotional space that allows her to plan and to feel for a prosperous and good future for herself. It puts her in the kind of space that once she has thought of all the bad things, then she has the time and space to think about the good things. And so I think there is a kind of individual virtue to the whole thing. In other words, she gets into the journey by getting the destination out of the way first. It's a little bit backwards from how it happens on Roshar, but I think that works because we're not on Roshar. We're on Scadrial, and the same virtues and vices don't necessarily apply. And there's also a way in which this series in the Era 2 Mistborn is about time itself, where you have Wayne who has time powers, you have Marasi who has time powers, and also the way that the prologues are operating, which I'll talk about in a moment. I think that the way that Steris kind of lives with one foot in the future and plans ahead speaks to that same theme of time, and how there's a difference that is essential between Scadrial and Roshar that has to do with like an entirely different voice, if you will, in the setting. So in the third Mistborn book podcast that I did, I talked about this Russian formalist named Mikhail Bakhtin, and the idea that he had about like the singular thing that a novel can deliver to its audience that no other art form is able to achieve, which is the polyphonous voice versus what he calls a monological voice. And so I don't want to go through that whole thing again, but just to quickly review the idea, basically he says that like a monological voice has to do with where every element in the story reinforces or contributes in some way to boiling down all of the ideas in the story to a single idea or moral, if you will. So, you know, like maybe when you were in school, you would talk about what is the moral of the story and, you know, examine it symbolically and be like, well, the moral of the story of Little Red Riding Hood is that you shouldn't just trust anyone. You should trust your instincts instead. And if somebody is giving you the wrong vibes, then you should be cautious about, what you do with that person. And everything in the story serves to contribute to you coming to that conclusion. With the polyphonous voice, the idea is that there are many different points of view that sit next to each other, but never synthesize into a particular point of view or moral that is conveyed to the audience. Instead, you get many competing but co-equal ideas that the reader has to kind of make their own choice about, or just sit uncomfortably with the kind of paradox of the entire situation and allow that energy to kind of stir in them. And I think Bakhtin is also interested in the idea that, like, in real life, there are all these different competing viewpoints where one is not necessarily better than the other. They're all just different. And that this version of a story, that is conveyed to us in a novel gives us that same feeling back, delivered in a piece of art. And so compared to all other kinds of art, that's like an element of real life that other art forms are not able to capture. But the novel is uniquely situated, according to Bakhtin, to deliver that same feeling of like, there is no one answer. There is no one point of view. The world is too complicated for that. And so what I said in that third book is that I think that Brandon Sanderson's universe and individual novels are monological, that they tend to boil down to some particular viewpoint or moral, if you will, or maybe like a handful of various morals, but that all of the elements of his story are being used in a way to, like, this person is bad and this person is good, and it's kind of saying something, However, because the Cosmere is so big, there's room for multiple ways to be good, multiple ways to be bad, and therefore multiple voices, if you will, a polyphony of voices is how Bakhtin would say it, that all share this Uber story, this Cosmere story. And one of the voices is the Scadrial story, and another one of the voices is the Roshar story, and another one of the voices is the Elantris story, and so on and so forth. So morality is slightly different from world to world. And I think that Steris in her story is kind of contributing to that difference, that this is not pointing out to us some kind of deep problem or vice in Steris, that as we go through the story, the way that she plans for the future is at times, I think at the beginning, it's kind of seen as an emotional crutch that fails her, that when she fails to anticipate the flooding of the church, she feels like a failure. She feels responsible for the whole thing. And that comes off to us as a kind of mental illness, that there's something wrong inside of Steris, and that her fixation on the future is dysfunctional and emotionally harmful to herself, that she needs to kind of like evolve past that or grow past it in some way, and that, it's holding her back. However, once, we start to go on the adventure and Steris insists on coming along, the plans that she makes for the future allow her to contribute to the success of the party, if you will, the adventuring party, where she has the supplies that people need. She brings, the weapons that Wax needs when the train robbers arrive. She has extra medals. She has, all of the different things because she's planned for every possible contingency. And now her, emotional crutch from the beginning appears to be useful. and that maybe the problem wasn't the actual planning for the future, but the fact that it wasn't tied to particular action or agency. Like, she's not present in these scenarios. And so by not having anything to do with her plans, the plans don't actually help her to accomplish anything. The problem was that she wasn't participating instead of the fact that she's oriented on the future. And then the future plans are kind of a source of comedy when we get to that great scene where they get the hotel room in New Saren, and she, hands over a tiny book to the hotel keeper and is like, here are all the ways that your hotel will be ruined in the future, right? She's like, some of these are not that likely. Don't worry about it too much. You'll probably never have a cattle stampede come through your place. She's so into the cattle stampede. But it's not played off as Steris is crazy necessarily, because everybody in that scene is being a little bit crazy in their own particular, form of being a weirdo, which is what makes that scene so delightful to me. It's probably my favorite single scene in all of Era 2. Everybody has their moment of indulging in their little weirdo freakiness that makes that character that character. And I think what it normalizes is that kind of outsiderness that I keep bringing up throughout the Cosmere, how there's, this idea of inside and outside, and that people create their identity around I am not like those people over there. But when we're all getting into this hotel situation, everybody is being a weird little outsider. And that is what includes them in this bizarre little found family, right? That Steris fits in perfectly with Wayne being a weirdo, with Wax breaking the windows open, and Milan talking about what size breast should I wear tonight? Oh, wait, I'll just be a man instead. And you better not break the skulls in my bag when you bring them up here. And, nobody is a quote unquote normal person, because the truth is that none of us are actually normal, right? We're all kind of weirdos. And so Steris making these lists is not some kind of actual deep dysfunction. It's not touching on the kind of sin or badness that it would be on Roshar. Instead, it's just the particular way that Steris is an outsider from the quote-unquote normal way to be, right? And I brought up time there because while Steris has one foot in the future, if you think about Wax in this story and the problem that he has, it's that he has one foot still stuck in the past. And I think the story makes a bigger problem out of that than Steris's way of how she is dealing with the future. And that Wax's problem, even from, 2 books ago, from the beginning of the entire Era 2 thing, is that he has this past in the roughs, and that he has a complicated relationship with that past version of himself, but that he needs to evolve and move away from it. He has to become a different man. That's the journey that he's on, if you will. And the way that he clings to that past self is the problem in the story, I think. And so to have these feelings that I talked about, about Lessie and his guilt and shame and self-hatred over what he did to Lessie, both back in the roughs and then again in the city, those feelings are the problem in the story for Wax, and they're directly tied to his past. I think that Wax believed that by leaving the roughs, he would kind of leave behind his problems. It would give him the chance to become a different version of himself where he could, I'm talking about the first book in the Era 2 series, where he goes into Ellendale and he takes over, running the household and the various businesses and getting involved in city politics. and that doing all of that will make him into a different person. He abstains from doing law enforcement stuff, and that if Wayne had never shown up, then he would probably be a very different kind of guy in this point in his life and the story. But he got sucked back into that world of law enforcement, and it keeps him in touch with the version of himself that was in the roughs. And that version of himself is, of course, painful because every single memory is tied to Lessie. He tried to run away from Lessie. He tried to run away from his guilt and shame by coming to the city, but you can't run away from yourself. That's the lesson of the previous book. His problems just came with him to the city, and then the book dramatizes that by making it literal, that Lessie shows up in the city and all of those problems that he tried to leave behind enter into his life once again, where he thinks of the roughs as this place of lawlessness that he has to kind of inscribe with law-abiding behavior, that he becomes the boundaries of civilization by being the lawman in the roughs. In the city, Lessie enters into Ellendale and she creates anarchy. She disrupts the very structure of the government. She disrupts the structure of the servants of God and his ability to control things in the city, control the fate of humanity. So she is she's the source of lawlessness in the place that is supposed to, structurally have the most law already inscribed on it. And so Wax has to step back into that role of being the one who creates the boundaries of good and evil, just like he did in the roughs. That's what he did in the previous book. And that meant that he had to destroy Lessie again. He's re-encountering that problem because he tried to run away from his feelings around it. Now he can't run away anymore. Like he has fully encountered it, and now he needs to emotionally cope with it. And it's not just about grief of losing someone. It's not merely guilt over what he knows was the right thing to do. Instead, it's his feelings towards himself. And I think his feelings towards his old self. It's the dysfunction that he has because he is looking backwards. It's that relationship to time as it has to do with yourself. And I think it's not a coincidence that the central plot of the story revolves around the Lord Ruler from 300 years ago. Like, we're looking backwards in time in a very meaningful way, like in terms of like the entire thrust of the story itself. We're trying to imagine how the ancients would have prioritized this and that once we get to the temple where the Bands of Mourning are supposed to be. Like, why would they create the traps the way that they did? Why would they pick this location? Why would they do this and that? In other words, we're trying to like put our headspace in the same headspace as those people from an ancient past. That's Wax's whole problem. He's thinking like his old self. He's stuck in his old self. That's the problem that he has to get past in this book, because it's creating this view of himself where he's trying to cling to that non-paradox view of the world, I think, where it's so much simpler to think of people in terms of perpetrator and victim. And Wayne, I think, beautifully brings this up early in the story, where I think it's not in this story, it's in the previous book. Yeah, it's got to be in the previous book, where Wayne brings up to Wax, he's like, it's not fair that I got a second chance and then all of these other guys end up getting killed in the moment. That when you found me, I was curled into a ball crying and I had thrown away the gun, and you uncovered my hiding spot, and you should have just like blown my brains out. You should have just killed me right then and there, right? Because I murdered a man and that was the wrong thing to do. Why do I get to have a second chance when these other guys who are murderers, we're just blowing them away in the street and they're dead forever. And Wax tells him, the reason I didn't shoot you when you were in the hiding place was because you didn't have the gun in your hand. You weren't actively attacking anyone. You were in a position where things could change for you, right? But if you had had your gun, if you had been shooting that man in that moment and I was there, then I would have killed you. And like Wayne hilariously is like, do you mean it, buddy? That's the sweetest thing you ever could have said to me. I wish I had another friend who would shoot me in the head if I was doing the wrong thing, right? Like, and the whole point of that comedic scene is because it's setting up what's going to happen with Leslie later. And in a more dramatic sense, it's kind of comedically foreshadowing the end of the book where Wax is going to kill Leslie by shooting her, with the magical bullet that has the allomantic spike in it or the hemalurgic spike in it, so that her agency comes to an end and Harmony can take her over and all of that stuff. He's doing the thing to Leslie that he promised he would do to Wayne to stop him. But let's examine the time of it all, if you will, in this scenario that Wayne is laying out and Wax's response to it, because what Wax tells him is, if I was there in that present moment where you were being the perpetrator and you were killing the victim, then I would have attacked and killed you, just like we attacked and killed those guys on the train in this book, right? The reason that they are perpetrators and victims is because of what is happening in the present moment right now. We're not thinking about their collective actions across a bigger piece of time that includes a lot of the past. We're not worried about what they might do in the future. In fact, I think that Wax has an optimistic view in terms of the potential for reforming criminals as it relates to the future. So like the future is a fountainhead of hope. Wayne is the proof of that, by taking him under arrest when he finds him in his hiding spot and then actively working with him to turn him into a lawman going forward, Wax is using the future as a site of redemption and change, so that instead of being a perpetrator or a victim, the lawman becomes the protector. And that protector exists in the protector, the perpetrator, and the victim exist exclusively within the present moment. That's how Wax explains it to Wayne. And so I think Wax's whole problem, like he successfully explains that to Wayne, but he doesn't apply it to himself. Wax's identity is fixed in the past, that he is a closed project, if you will, of a person because he killed Leslie. He killed the person that he loves. And therefore, forever into the future, he can't be reformed or changed. He's going to be the kind of person who destroys his loved ones. Therefore, he cannot have the project of falling in love with anybody else, of creating a future with someone. And so, the entire marriage situation sends him into a spiral of anxiety, not because he's afraid to commit, but because he's afraid of being the man that he was in the past. He's not looking at himself as he is right now in the present. He's only considering who he was in the past and projecting that forward forever and ever. And so I think that Steris's view of being, one step in the future is not so much tied to the relationship that we have with the future on Roshar, but it's about balancing out the way that Wax has one foot in the past. They both are kind of like, one step in the wrong direction from the present. And I think it makes both of them anxious about whatever it is that they're actually doing right now And the romance that develops in this book between the two of them is about both of them kind of taking a step towards each other in terms of time by entering into the present moment, right? So they have that great scene on the train where Steris has all of their income receipts and they're going to go hunting after some lost money in the accounting error. She says like they're off by like $3 or $4 or something like that. And that's not the kind of thing that at first seems exciting to Wax, sitting here and doing math. But they make a real connection in the present moment because they're both interested in solving mysteries. And this is just like a little miniature mystery. It's not the kind of mystery that has the high stakes of somebody's life depending on it and whatnot, but it is a mystery nonetheless, and they tackle it together, and it gives their personalities a chance to relax from the fixations that they have that sit outside of this present moment. And once they're both in that present moment, that's when they are able to make a new connection to each other. And I think that is the foundation that their romantic relationship builds up from. And so it's not about the way that, when Steris first approaches Wax, she has all of these plans about the future, all of these contracts, these contingencies. And that's not something that appeals to Wax at all in the first book because he is looking backwards into the past so much. That's part of the reason why they miss each other, in terms of forming an actual emotional relationship, because they're just oriented in different directions, literally. It's only once they come to relax and bond over this issue of the present moment that things begin to build. And Steris's contingency plans manage to contribute backwards, if you will, to the present moment. She's thinking ahead, she's planning ahead, she's bringing necessary materials for what might happen, and then she is able to deploy those materials in the present moment to make a connection with Wax, right? So she has the gun that he needs at the ball. She brings one of his guns after his guns have been confiscated, and they managed to, like, she has it wrapped around her leg or something, and they tear it off of the holder that she made for herself. She's able to, create a distraction because she brings the stuff, that's like an antidote for taking poison that'll make you throw up. So she throws up on the table and makes a big distraction, and that allows Wax to pull off his part of the plan in the present moment. And so both of them contribute to the success of the present moment because of Steris's fixation. Wax's fixation never contributes to the success of the present moment, right? Because it's the problem in the story. And what allows Wax, I think, partially to get past that whole thing is this new evolving connection to Steris, the way that they're building something right here and now, and the way that it affirms who Steris is in terms of her orientation towards the future is what allows them to make a path and a life together. Steris doesn't have to fit into what Wax wanted and experienced in the past. Instead, she gets to be who she is, and Wax gets to evolve into somebody who can find love in the future. And if we look at this kind of temporal relationship, with Wayne, I think he's someone who is always in the present moment, right? Like his relationship to the past does have the same kind of tragic problems that Wax does, but he's far less in touch with his feelings of guilt and self-loathing than Wax is. Like Wax is way more of a broody kind of hero, and Wayne is a way more upbeat and funny kind of guy, because he is experiencing the present moment by reframing it in all of these hilarious ways, like where he goes to a bar and imagines it to be a place of worship, like a church, instead of the, establishment dedicated to getting you drunk. And so he's a guy who's always, I think, looking at the problem that is at hand right here, right now, and coming up with solutions in the moment. He's not thinking ahead about what might happen the way that Steris is, and creating anxiety for himself that he has to get over by coping with it the way that she does. And he's not brooding on the mistakes that he made in the past and trying to evolve into some other different kind of person who won't repeat those mistakes. Instead, Wayne just has a relationship with the present that guides his actions right here and now to be the most kind of like flexible but appropriate answer for whatever situation he happens to be facing. And then if we apply this kind of temporal symbolism to Marcy, I think you can immediately see that she also has this relationship where she has one foot in the past in terms of where she gets her data and statistics, and then using that with one foot in the future to try and create a better world for everyone right now in the present world. That the past is kind of instrumentalized and analyzed in order to produce useful information for the future to become a better place where those mistakes don't repeat themselves. And so I think she's kind of taking the best intentions of Wax and the usefulness of Steris, and she's kind of synthesizing it into one person, where Wayne is totally focused on being in the moment. He's just in the present all the time. Marcy is both in the past and in the future to engineer a present that is oriented towards progress, right? So her relationship with she also has a direct relationship to the present, is what I'm saying, but it is completely the opposite of Wayne's orientation. So I think that's part of the reason why those two characters are paired together for a good portion of the book. Like Wayne and Marcy have to work together. And when you think about the ways that they are opposites, they also have that kind of opposite time power as well, right? Where Wax can speed up time for himself and Marcy speeds up time for everyone else. Where Wayne is highly improvisational, Marcy is extremely calculated, right? She's very data driven. And Wayne is just kind of making it up as he goes along. But for both of them, the present is the moment that is the most important. And I think if we compare all of the characters and what the story is kind of endorsing, I think that Wax is the biggest problem with his orientation towards the past, but not having any hope for the future. Like he's not approaching the future in the same way that Marcy and Steris are. But Wayne being stuck in the present without any consideration of his past and any consideration of the future is not that great either. Like he needs to learn some of Marcy's tricks the way that Marcy picks up on some of Wayne's style of doing things as well. I think he has more to learn from Marcy than Marcy has to learn from him, is the feeling that the story gives me when I read it. In Steris's anxieties about the future, there's that wonderful, beautiful moment of vulnerability that she has where she's reading the biology of sex book on the train and Wax picks it up and realizes what it is and her shame and embarrassment about it. But it reveals her anxiety about, is she going to be able to perform the duties of a wife when she has absolutely no experience, no access to information, therefore no way to create plans about the future? Will she be able, like, they tell her, all of these other people that she tried to talk to, you will understand in the moment what it is that you're supposed to do. Your body will respond to the moment appropriately in the present. And Steris just doesn't trust that. She doesn't trust the present moment. That is the moment that always betrays her. And so she wants to and needs to make plans for the future. But it's when Wax meets her in the present, and, they have that moment where they kiss. They have that moment where, there's a promise of that affection and that physical, sexual moment that's going to happen in the near future at the end of the story where they get married. The anxiety is not present in Steris anymore, because in the present moment, she is having this very natural, normal, real reaction to Wax. He's able to pull her back into the present moment. And I think the story is telling us that that is the right place for Steris to be. Not that her making plans for the future is wrong necessarily, but that it's better to be in the present and to make those plans about the future in a way where you have more trust in who you will be once you get to that moment that you need the plans. But the other reason that I bring up that whole polyphonous voice thing and monological voice that I did earlier is because the other thing that's happening in the story is that we are getting, and we have had this to some degree since the first book with Miles' 100 Lives, but much more in the previous book, and I think even in this book as well. We're getting an interaction, a really strong interaction between the voice of Scadrial, if you will, and some other kind of alien voice. There is this god Trell who is mysterious and we don't understand what they're about right now, but that sits outside of the knowledge of Harmony. So when Lessie had the one spike of metal in her, she had a spike that had something to do with a metal that Harmony could not perceive and did not understand. And that seems totally impossible because the world of Scadrial is made up, if you will, of the body of preservation and ruin. And so everything on the planet is literally Harmony, which means that this metal must come from some other world. And it's not coming from Roshar or Elantris or Warbreaker or any of these other worlds that we've been to so far. It's from some other place. And that means that it's one of these other gods. And we get a glimpse of that near the end of the book where once again Wax meets with God and has a conversation with him. And Harmony reveals to him this energy that is kind of wrapping itself around the world and admits to Wax that he has no idea what this is. And so there's another one of these voices coming into contact with the voice of Scadrial. And I think that the schism that it creates is the way that, I was talking about how the morality on Roshar is different. There's still a good and a bad. There's still right and wrong. But that good and bad is like slightly different for very particular reasons between the two places. And I think if you tried to operate the way that Steris is able to successfully grapple with the future and be a good person and be in the right, to be on the good side of things, on Roshar, she wouldn't be so much. Wherever this Trell god is from, they have a different set of, moral rights and wrongs that is crashing into the voice of Scadrial and is, literally a lack of harmony between those two voices. The way that Harmony's name right there implies a kind of musicality almost and includes the idea of multiple voices. Harmony's inability to have dialogue with this other god is a big source of the problem here. And the alienness, the interaction of aliens in this story happens not only with this, who is Trell and what are the followers of Trell and what is their morality. There are the people from the south of Scadrial who have a totally different culture, an alien culture, versus the Elendel people, and have gone through enormous suffering over the last 3 centuries if you compare it to the people in the basin. Wax's people have had it easy, compared to the Malwish, the people from the other side of the world. And the story brings back that kind of social Darwinism idea that I talked about, from the colonialist thinking in the previous Mistborn book, where the more you suffer, the more advanced and the greater you become. That overcoming difficulties creates a kind of virtue all on its own. When they meet Alec, he's very different, from anybody else that they've met, right? He has this bizarre mask and he doesn't speak the same language. The technology that he has as it relates to feruchemy and allomancy is completely different from what we've seen in the basin so far. And it's far more advanced. They have airships. They have the ability to instantaneously translate languages that they've never encountered before. And at the end of the story, we see that we're able to have feruchemical powers given to people who don't have access to that metal, where Wax is able to touch the copper mind of the coin and get the memory of the survivor when he never has been able to use copper mines before or after. All of those things are unthinkable in the society of the basin. They are way more advanced than anything that we've even come close to seeing in the kind of progress, that is basically 1800s with telegraphs and steam engines and stuff like that. But Alec has his own moral system, like his own cultural system that gives the boundaries of what is right and wrong. And so when he interacts with Wax, he has this very worshipful language because that is the propriety of his people. It would be wrong for him to just treat Wax like any other person because he has these magical abilities that are super rare in the Malwish gene pool, and therefore they are highly valued. But I think the lack of allomancers and probably the lack of feruchemists is also why they have figured out some way to kind of democratize these powers, if you will, and distribute them to everyone who doesn't have access to them. So he's able to wear these medallions that take the ability of people to store their warmth and then use it for later. He can put on one of those medallions and then he's able to be in the very cold climate of the mountains and he doesn't need a coat or anything else. He just draws on the heat of the metal mind. It's the same thing for creating connections that allow him to instantly translate stuff or to reduce his weight so that the airship can fly through the air. In other words, everyone in the culture has powers because they've figured out how to redistribute those abilities from being super rare and highly valued within the culture. It's still that linguistic remnant of that in the way that he venerates Wax. But in practice, the powers are like extremely common and he's just constantly swapping them out according to like what he needs in the moment. Because there are way more feruchemists and allomancers in the valley, there's no need to try and create a technology that redistributes those powers to everyone in the community. And in fact, there's like a lot of good reasons to not do that because that would make the powers much more difficult to control and channel within the population. Like if everyone can be a coin shot, then that makes everyone far more dangerous because of the way that coin shots are thought of in the Elendel society. It's tied to that violence that I keep talking about that, Kelsier kind of inscribed on the culture. That being a murderer is a good thing, and that using your allomantic powers to kill your enemies is a virtue. Once you give everybody the ability to be a coin shot, you're going to have many, many more murderers. So there's a kind of social Darwinism pressure, if you will, in the opposite direction to democratizing powers in the valley. But all of that, the point being that there's two different ways of being that are alien to each other and can't be easily or quickly reconciled, which is Baktine's definition of the polyphonous voice. So this story, more than any of the other ones in Era 2, contains that energy of the polyphonous voice. Alec has virtues and vices that are different than the rest of the Elendel characters. I think that the story more leans in the direction of the Elendel characters and saying, yeah, these are the right and wrong ways to do things in a fundamental sense on Scadrial, but it doesn't just out of hand discount the Malwish ways of doing things, because when the Malwish encounter the Elendel culture, the thing that happens to them is that they are tortured and murdered. They are incarcerated. They're treated as inferior savages and alien others. They're discriminated against in ways that it's not clear that they would have treated the people from Elendel the same way if the shoe was on the other foot. And so that's not a good way to be. That is an evil way that, the set was doing the wrong thing in the way that they treated the Malwish. And it made the Malwish into victims, which I think gives them a kind of vulnerability that makes us have good feelings towards them. We feel that Alec and the rest of the Malwish that we meet are the victims of the set. And so they also deserve to keep their technology, to go back home to their people. And they have the right to live in a way that's different from the people in Elendel. And on a much more smaller and mundane scale, there's also the idea that, like I was talking about in the first book of The Insider, The Outsider, the people who are in the capital city, and then the people in all of the surrounding areas, and the way that for the first time Wax encounters the unfairness that Elendel is dealing with the outer kingdoms and how they're taxing them multiple times. They're not allowing them to set up a rail system that would bypass Elendel completely. Instead, they're taxing them when they come in with their goods, and they're taxing them on the way out. And all of the benefits of the taxing in terms of creating better infrastructure and things like that stays within Elendel, and the outer provinces, which are producing the necessary goods that Elendel needs access to, are getting taxed, in an unfair way. And even though those outer places participate in the democracy that decides the rules around that whole thing, the coalitions within Elendel are too entrenched and powerful to allow for a change and evolution of the central structure. And so Wax has to admit to himself that there's a kind of systemic injustice to the way that things are being set up between the Roughs and Elendel, but also between Elendel and the other, surrounding cities. And the thing that it's producing in those cities is a kind of virtuous resentment against Elendel, that they see Elendel as the enemy, and Wax can't even disagree with it. He's like, yeah, it's true. They really are double dealing and being unfair with these places, and they're right to be angry about it. And so the bad behavior of Elendel is alienating those surrounding areas, not just the Roughs, but also, the surrounding cities, and othering them in a way that creates an alienness, a new way of virtue and vice that is going to come back on Elendel and bite it if they don't find a way to nip the whole thing in the bud. So I think that theme of alienness, on the cosmic level, has to do with an invasion of Trell into the Scadrial world. And then if we bring it one level down from that, you have the Malwish and the people of the valley that Harmony protected after the Catasandra. That alien culture is interacting with them. But then the alienation that's happening on the most local level is also a really important part of the story, and the way that it's creating these two distinct and competing classes within the culture itself. It's setting things up for a kind of civil war that's going to be really dysfunctional and unfavorable for them right when they're encountering all of these outside influences. And weirdly, I think we're also getting at the same time, at the end of the story, a way that Marasi and then Wax become alien in the way that they come into direct contact with divinity. So on the one hand, Wax dies in this story and meets Harmony face to face, and it kind of like in a moment where he stands between life and death and is kind of in the afterlife, if you will. And Harmony forces him to come in contact with the way that he is framing his entire life through mistakes that he made and choices that he made in the past, that he is hiding from the present moment by keeping himself in the past, and that this is holding him back because he demands of Harmony, like, why don't you do something? There's problems in the world and you refuse to solve them. And Harmony kind of shows him, like, how much can I solve without creating new problems? It's more complicated than this simple right and wrong. And Wax accuses him of being a perpetrator who preys on victims by abstaining from doing anything at all. So that when, some kind of accident or illness befalls a small child and they end up dying from that really what happened is that Harmony chose to murder that child through his inaction. That's kind of the accusation that Wax is leveling at Harmony. And Harmony's response to that is like, it's not that simple. That life is not about avoiding pain. Instead, you need to be building resilience. You need to be finding the way to be the kind of person who can heal and who can cultivate hope and opportunities for the future. And that unfortunately, this means coming into contact with suffering and failure in the present moment, right? And that means that you have to have a kind of disposition of evolving and changing and adapting. And that's not the kind of thing that Wax is interested in. He wants to hold on to this worldview of perpetrator and victim and doesn't want to come into contact with the paradox of the whole thing. But I think in that moment, he is able to let himself come into contact with it. And that's why I say that there's an alienness to the whole thing, because once he takes the Bands of Mourning and gets all of the ferrochemical powers fully charged and all of the allomantic powers fully charged, he becomes a different type of being whose, supreme potency would allow him to reshape things in a way that shifts his perspective. That, there's at one point when he's using the Bands of Mourning that he thinks to himself, I should really slow down how quickly I'm burning through these powers and save some for the future. But he can't really bring himself to do it. It marries him to the moment in a very particular way. It forces him into doing. We see this with investiture all the time throughout all the way back to Elantris, right? When the door is pushing on Raoden, he has this feeling of, a huge amount of energy that is wanting to come through and push through him and to be used in the moment. We see that with Kaladin, with Zeth, and all of the other, Shallan. Whenever they have the Stormlight inside of them, they need to act right now. That seems to be a fundamental feature of investiture, that it wants to be spent in the present moment. And I think that's because the energy itself comes from the spiritual realm that we've gotten glimpses of, where there is no time, which is to say that all time is the present moment. So Wax being pushed into this, moment of being constantly present is directly tied to how investiture itself works and reorientates his perspective, and it allows him to kind of evolve past this feeling about himself that's tied to his past. He's able to see himself as he is in the present, and even to let go of making specific plans for the future, that he needs to be more focused on the here and now than on any other place in his life. I think this fixation with the past when it comes to Wax is even expressed in the very structure of the novels themselves. So what we see in the first novel, vis-a-vis the prologue, is this story that happens at the end of his time in the Roughs. It's the moment where he kills Lessie that forces him to leave the Roughs. So it's the kind of the very last thing that happens to him, the climax of his time in the Roughs, if you will. And then in the second book, we go back in time to the first time that he met Lessie. And so his early days in the Roughs, but still tied to the Roughs. And then here in the third book, we go back even further to a time where Wax was a small child and was, being brought up in the city. But since he has a mixed heritage with the Terrace people, he spends some of his time with his grandmother being fostered as a Terrace native and learning about that part of his heritage. But he wants to apply his kind of alien values, if you will, to their culture, and bringing in lawmen who are holding them to this other standard of justice and the correct behavior that you should have as a community that has nothing to do with being a Terrace person. Wax is trying to try to impose that on the Terrace people in that little short story. But what you can see is that there's a movement structurally further and further into the past as we start each book. And so in a formal kind of structural way to the novels themselves, we're moving backwards in time. And I think that's directly linked. Each time it is Wax who we're seeing the story of. And so I think that shows us the way that Wax is himself tied to his past, and that's part of his problem in the story. And because we're encountering this alien way of being in Trell, at the end of the story, what we see is, there's these new rights and wrongs that have been somewhat metabolized by the evil group, the Set, that Wax's uncle, and it turns out his sister, are a part of. But they have a whole different set of values about what's right and wrong. which means that they have an entirely different relationship with the present and with the future. And so the set is all about these long-term plans that involve centuries of time. But Trell turns around at the end of the story and says, you know what? Change of plans. We actually don't need your world at all. And all of this culture and everything about it is a big problem. And so what we're going to do is wipe the slate clean. And while I think that definitely comes off as sinister and evil in the story, and, it seems to be a badness that supersedes these different points of view, these polyphonous voices, if you will, within the larger Cosmere, I think it nonetheless underlines the way that morality is located in the present and not in the future so much in this era too of Mistborn, so that we need to be thinking about what is the right thing to do in the here and now, and that, plotting for the future or believing that, there will be no future are a real problem and a bad way of being. And of course, there's all kinds of new world building elements and wrinkles in the magic system that are introduced here, some of which are still kind of confusing to me as a reader, even though, I'm very, very familiar with the Cosmere and have reread these books many times. It's not clear to me that these are actually the same bands that were worn by the Lord Ruler in the first book. Whenever I've reread that novel, I've paid particular attention to what happens to those bands. Do other people encounter them? Are they able to use them? It doesn't seem like it. It seems like this whole thing is related to some other larger project by someone claiming to be the Lord Ruler, and that none of this actually has anything to do with his culture and the way that he did things in his story. Because it really feels to me like if he did have this kind of backup weapon and at this temple and all this stuff like this, that it would have been mentioned in those secret places in each one of the cities that Vin and Elend were going to in the second and third book, right? I guess mainly in the third book they were doing that. These kind of store caches of information and supplies that were going to help people to survive the end of the world. It seems to me like he would have been like, oh, by the way, I've got a fully charged set of bracers that anybody can use to fight God, over here. Just go ahead and go pick them up if you need that kind of power boost. Would have been a useful note to drop. So it feels like this is something totally different. And instead, by having this Indiana Jones style temple or dungeon full of bizarre traps and false treasure rooms and stuff like that, that the whole thing is designed around that idea of social Darwinism, that there is a virtue to suffering and failure that helps us to evolve and become more deserving of success. That's the reason for all of the convoluted traps and architecture. It's to break people out of the complacency of if you want power, you need to suffer for it. At the same time, though, the bands are on the outside of the temple and kind of easy to access without having to go through all of those hardships. And so there's also something there about, not just assuming that automatically suffering is good for its own sake, and also related to that idea that happens in the second Mistborn book where Vin lets the power go instead of using it. And that choice is shown to be kind of like an evil or bad choice in the story because it lets ruin out. There's something good about Wayne taking the Bands of Mourning from the statue on the outside of the place and getting access to that power right away, that having access to power, taking power is a good thing in Scadrial morality, if you will. And that maybe the lesson that's being taught there is learning to see where that power is instead of just assuming that the power always lies behind hardship. Sometimes it's just right there where you can reach out and take it. But of course, the really big mind-blowing wrinkle in the whole thing is that somehow Kelsier still exists and that he's out there with a spike driven through his head and that the survivor really did survive death and that the whole thing is not like a cynical manipulation of religion and instead has some kind of truth to it that's really mysterious, but it's going to be elucidated and explained in the totally shocking, completely Cosmere changing short story that follows this one called Mistborn: The Secret History. And so that's going to be the next thing that I read. And it's, I mean, talk about polyphony and bringing together different worlds. This is going to change everything.